So using gouache paint and on how to use gouache paint for this design value scale assignment and moving forward with the color wheel, the materials that we're going to need are going to be gouache. So in my case, I'm using black and white. And for me, I'm using the Winsor Newton and the M. Graham and Company interchangeable. You're going to need a cup. For me, I'm using this cup here for water. Any old jar or whatnot can work just fine. You also are going to need a set of brushes that you're comfortable using. And then, of course, your paper. I like to use the Bristol paper. I think it's the best material for this as far as a design class, or a cardstock. And then last but not least, any kind of palette. So you can use, like an old, cap, like mayonnaise cap lid, little plastic containers, and even just like a traditional palette, okay? So whatever you have handy, you can even use like an old ceramic plate. You don't need to have anything special, all right? So everybody should have a palette knife. A palette knife is the ideal material to use, and it creates kind of a scraping back and forth to allow you to mix your gouache. If you don't have a palette knife, I would suggest getting like a plastic knife, like disposable plastic knife is a good place to start. I would not use my brushes to mix my paints, okay? I would really like you to avoid doing that. The brushes that I like to use the most for these types of exercises are as follows. Let's see. I really like the number 8 flat. I think works really well to get your nice progression. I really like a number 10 round. I think works really well. And then I really love this diagonal 3/8 flat, which is a beautiful brush to work and getting that nice progression to give that nice consistent coat, okay? So whatever you have available to you will work nicely. And also decide for yourself. Some people really prefer a thicker brush. I would advise you to be careful with these big thick brushes though, because it does sop up a lot of gouache and it creates a lot of waste when we're working in such a small study for this exercise. So as we talked about before in my explanation, gouache, when it comes right out of the tube, most gouaches, depending on the brands you're using, will need a little bit of water. So for every half teaspoon of gouache, you want at least 1 drop of water, okay? So I'm actually going to use my little palette plate, and I'm going to create a value, and so I'm going to kind of show you the difference. So when you have a gouache that's been used before, and you can kind of see this here and what I'm showing you, it's a little bit drier. It's kind of like toothpaste when it kind of pops up and down, and there's no like residual oily water kind of coming out of that. Whereas with a new set, which I don't know if I've used this one yet, sometimes it's really liquidy and wet as it's coming out. So this is a much moister gouache than this older black that I've been using. So pay attention to how much moisture is already in that tube when it comes out. So I'm going to start with my white. So I'm going to get myself that nice quantity on in my little palette, okay, that I'm pretty happy with. Using my 10-inch round, I'm actually going to use this to sop up some of my water and create that drip of water onto my my gouache, because I can't use it right out of the tube. I need a little bit of water to create that nice creamy half and half consistency, because the gouache right out of the tube will create cracking, and that's what we want to avoid. So we want this really nice half and half, or even maybe really nice heavy cream kind of consistency. And you can see here that I'm using my palette knife to kind of add and mix that all together, right? And I'm not wasting any of it by using that palette knife. I'm going to rinse my palette knife off in my water, and then use my rag to clean that off. Okay. So from here, if I have not created white yet in my value scale, I would use that. But in this instance, I want to create a lighter, a very light value gray that's almost fully white. So in doing so, it would be unwise of me to take this and just kind of to create a big dunk inside of there. I would be better off to take my palette knife and to take a very subtle amount just at the tip of my palette knife. Do you see how small amount it takes? And I'm just going to kind of come in and place that into my white and start to mix around. And again, I'm using my palette knife and not my brush to do so. And that just that small quantity, that tiny bit of quantity, what that creates is an off, very subtle grayish white. Okay? So I want everyone to understand how little pigment you need to really alter some of your colors, to do your value scale, right? And so in doing so, I'm getting that nice mix. And I'm not using a lot of pigment because, again, this is a smaller study. Cleaning my palette knife off, and then coming in. And so what also you need to do is keep in mind is when you saturate your brush in water, the water in the brush will dilute your pigment. It is imperative that you come in and wring out any residual water inside your brush before you kind of go into your gouache, okay? So kind of coming in here, I'm just going to start to feel this out. And I can already tell that I'm going to need just a tiny bit more water because it's not quite the consistency that I want. I want it to be the consistency of like a heavy cream, and it's still a little too thick. So I'm going to come back in and start to move that around a little bit. And then I'm going to come to my value chart, right? So I've already been working on this from previous demonstrations, but I have a beautiful little 2x2 square that it's ready to work on. So in that square, I've got my gouache ready to go. I think I need a little bit more. Get that ready. Nice and well done. And I'm going to go in a progression from my right to left in a horizontal, and then from my right to left in the vertical. So you can see that in the demonstration. I'm actually going to go from left to right, actually. Going in one direction, giving that a second as it starts to dry, right? Because you can see that I put my gouache down, and then coming in for a second coat from the horizontal to the vertical, right? And that's it. That's all we need to do to create that nice consistent coat with no streaks. And then from here I have some pigment still left. So I could either start completely over, but it's imperative that I clean my brush, but I'm not going to start over because I'm still working in those values. I'm now going to add a little bit more of my black to my white pigment and start to mix that up, get it really nice and mixed. And if I need to, like if this becomes really kind of streaky, I would want to transport this into my other palettes to get that nice consistent color. Because as of right now, you know, it's a little streaky still to get my next value. Okay? So as I'm mixing around, and sometimes it's even nice to have a mixing brush, like a brush that goes between your palette knife and your brushing, you know, and then kind of coming in, getting everything really nice and mixed. But I would not use this brush to actually put down on my paper because you don't want to create any streaks. And the streaks happen when any kind of pigment lives deep in the center of the brush at the stem of the bristles. And when you start to smear and to spread it across, it kind of creates streaks. So So you really want to avoid that, okay? So as I'm cleaning out from my previous color, making sure it's nice and clean, drying that off really well. And if you need to clean it with soap and water, please do so. So from there, coming in, getting my next coat, and then creating my next value, right? One, working my way across. And as I go from one direction, I get my pigment, and I go in the horizontal. And this time I went vertical first. It doesn't have to be any rhyme or reason, and then you can do your next value, okay? And that, my friends, is how we begin to use gouache. Make sure it's that nice creamy consistency. Make sure you're not mixing your paints with the brushes that you're planning to paint onto your surfaces. If it's too thin, add more pigment or allow it to dry for 24 hours and do a second coat on top. We do not want to see transparency. We don't want to see through these. But at the same time, if they're too thick or they're cracking, you need to add more drops of water. The consistency of like a half and half is ideal.